Please welcome data scientist at GitHub, Anna Filippova.
Good afternoon. How y'all doing today? How y'all doing today? There we go. Hi, I'm Anna. I'm a data scientist here at GitHub, and this is the state of the Octoverse. The Octoverse report is something that we publish every year to celebrate you, our community, and the things that you've built over the year. But this year is special. You've heard Jason say this morning that our community has grown faster this year on almost every dimension. This year is also our 10th birthday. That means 10 years of code, 10 years of collaboration, and 10 years of community. And so this year, we put together a special Octoverse. In it, we look back on your contributions to the platform, whether they're open or inner source, and what your contributions mean for how software development has changed over the last 10 years. And today, we're excited to share with you the most important trends that we've seen and look ahead to where we're heading in the next 10 years together. I'm very thrilled to invite Steve O'Grady on stage to join me. Steve is a principal analyst and co-founder of Redmonk, and Redmonk is a developer-focused analyst firm. They specialize in the tools of a developer's trade, your trade, what you're doing, how you're doing it, and why. Welcome, Steve.
Beautiful. Shall we?
Welcome, Steve. It's really good to have you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So, Steve and I are going to talk about 3 trends that we found the most exciting in this year's State of the Octoverse. The first is the growing geographic diversity of our community, the evolution of programming language communities on the platform, and of course, what has and hasn't changed in open source over the last 10 years. I'm really excited. Shall we get started?
Let's do it.
All right. Now, there are a couple of things that make me really, really happy when I look at where our contributors come from this year. And the first is that our contributors span so much of the globe. And the second is the amount of growth that we're seeing in some of the international communities in particular. Take a look at Brazil. Brazil is number 7 on our list of countries with the most contributors this year. And that's already pretty cool. But they've been holding steady in that spot for 2 years now. Take a look at this growth over the past 5 years. Brazil's been steadily moving up in the rankings from 10th place 5 years ago. That is really impressive growth. Steve, I'd love to turn this over to you. What can you tell us about the technology scene in Brazil over these past 5 years?
So over the past 5 years, I think it's been interesting. And to me, to understand the past 5 years, you have to go back certainly ways. I don't know if we have anybody in the audience who used to attend the old Java ones. There was a, let's say, very sizable and very, what's the best word, probably enthusiastic contingent of Brazilian Java developers who attended every year, many of whom were running around in Brazilian flags, the whole bit. So the country, certainly in the region, has had a passion, for technology that goes back a long ways. Over the last, say, 5 or more years, really what we've seen is a tremendous uptick, certainly in the not just investments in technology, but the embrace of open source in particular. So, there was a research study that came out, I think it was 2017, saying that about 93% of federal Brazilian governmental organizations use open source. 85% of them contribute new open source code to the world.
85%.
85%, exactly.
That's amazing.
And at the state level, I think the numbers were 76, if I remember right, and it's just 50 and change, contributing back. So the net is that you have a region, and more particularly a government for that region, which are heavily invested in the usage and therefore the production of open source. So, this sort of reflects the environment that we've seen, right? You see this in sort of an uptick in venture interest, an uptick in projects coming out, sort of the region. So it's just it's a region with a lot of passion, a lot of enthusiasm, and a lot of investments in and around open source more generally.
That's an incredible transformation. And I think one example we're seeing that I'm really excited about is how technology is being used to improve efficiency in markets like this. We know that Brazil is working to digitize their invoicing and tax reporting and standardizing this with an electronic standard called NFE. But I've just recently learned that you can find several projects supporting this effort right here on GitHub. From the code you use to generate the NFTs, to communicating them with an API, awesome, all the way to billing integrations with banks.
That's
so
great.
Thanks, Brazil, for sharing this with the world.
Yeah.
Now, I'd like to spin the globe a little bit, and even though it's not our biggest community of contributors yet, I want to call out a community that's hit almost every one of our fastest growing lists this year, and that's Nigeria.
Yeah. Hell yeah.
Yeah. All right. You ready for this? Nigeria is our 4th highest growing country by contributors this year. And not only that, it has more than doubled the number of new organizations created. And it's almost doubled the number of repositories created this year. And that's both for open source repositories and in general. So Steve, turning over to you again, what could be behind this accelerating growth?
Again, I think it's essentially an embrace of open source, sort of on a regional level, and more particularly, within a couple of industries, right? So if you go back the 2014, 2015 timeframe, oil, which was one of the principal industries contributing to GDP, certainly had some, let's say, systemic issues, with that industry. But even dating back farther than that, Nigeria has, sort of been a hotbed of talent, and more particularly, potential talent, coming out of the region. So, you see this sort of reflected in, numbers like, beginning, I think it was in 2015 or 2016. You've seen venture growth creep up about 20%, sort of annually, or thereabouts. And the interesting thing actually is that it actually has grown in a way that's consistent with patterns in North America. So what we've seen at Redmonk, dating back to about 2006, which many in the audience sort of may recognize that was the first introduction of cloud services, infrastructure as a cloud. What we saw was essentially a split in terms of the size of venture commitments and the volume of venture commitments. They used to track pretty closely, but in 2006, as the cost of raising a business, or growing a business rather, came down, the size of deals commensurately went down, but the actual total number of deals then went up. So in other words, you didn't have as many big deals, but you had many, many more smaller deals. And that's consistent with the pattern that we've seen in Nigeria. And we see this, particularly in a couple of verticals and a couple of spaces, right? So a little less than half, about 42% as of 2016, 2017 of Nigerians across the country had access to traditional financial services, right? So this has led to sort of a growth in technology and projects, Amplify Pay, Paystack, and so on, that try to bring some of these financial services to the Nigerian population. And you really see the opportunities that Nigeria has in the sense that they don't have a ton of pre-existing infrastructure, legacy infrastructure to contend with. You've seen this in mobile, you see this in payments. So they have the opportunity to take that next step forward. The one thing for any conference organizers or any other vendors in the audience tonight, the one thing that we hear consistently from Nigerian technologists is the fact that it's very difficult for them to get visas. So the net is that it's a huge, sort of hotbed of potential talent. We just have to take the next step and enable them to attend the conferences and come to events like this one to make it easier. So yeah, Nigeria is definitely exploding.
You heard that. Nigeria is exploding. Make sure you invite people to come and speak at your conferences. Now, I think what you said about local payments infrastructure is really interesting. It makes me think of a couple of really cool projects that we're seeing coming out of Nigeria that live right here on GitHub. For example, Guobo is a project that simplifies accepting payments from platforms like Paystack and Amplify Pay that you've just mentioned. And there's also integrations with things like Node.js and Laravel across all of these payment tools, and all of that lives on GitHub. This is really exciting. Before I move on to our next theme, I really want to call out some of our other fastest growing communities internationally. Similar to Nigeria, Egypt is on almost all of our fastest growing lists this year. There it is, our fastest growing list. Bangladesh has grown more than 1.5 times. I think that's incredible. And topping off our list are communities from Hong Kong and Singapore. A huge shout out to developers in all of these places. Amen. Can you give them a round?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Come on. There we go.
Right. And of course, we can't talk about our global communities of contributors without mentioning the people on the ground that are supporting them, like our campus experts in places like Brazil and Nigeria, and partners on the ground like DevMark, who are helping us make these changes in these communities. And of course, Steve, the communities that live on GitHub, they aren't restricted to geographic borders.
They're not.
So let's talk about the communities that are at the heart of software development anywhere in the world, and that's programming languages.
Always a favorite.
All right. Now, you might have noticed that TypeScript is everywhere on our lists of programming languages. And it's on every list we published, and it's steadily trending upwards. It's the 7th most popular language on GitHub right now, and if that's not impressive, it's up 3 spots from last year alone, when it first appeared in the top 10. That's huge growth. And not only is one of our fastest growing languages, it's also popular in every region that our contributors come from. And on top of that, Definitely Typed, which is a repository for TypeScript type definitions, is one of our top 10 open source projects this year. So Steve, why do developers love TypeScript so much?
Oh yeah, that's how long do we have, right? No, TypeScript's interesting because we at Redmonk run our own language rankings. We do it twice a year, and it's been fun to watch TypeScript go from ranks in the 30s and 40s and 50s, all the way up to top 20s. And I think there's any number of different reasons we could sort of point to for that. Certainly the sort of ability to compile to JavaScript, and the ability essentially to intermingle, sort of in that environment, bring those skills over is huge. Because JavaScript is ubiquitous and is number one on our rankings. It has been for a while. So we're able to sort of build off of that fundamental strength, that fundamental size of the community. But sort of I think importantly, one of the things that TypeScript brings is the optional static typing. So in other words, now you're introducing an element of safety to the language, which is helpful from a tooling standpoint. It's helpful from a essentially development standpoint in terms of building sort of safer code, which is certainly one of the priorities that we see both on the developer side and on the sort of enterprise side moving forward. So I'm sure the TypeScript folks in the audience will be irritated that we don't spend the entire time talking about TypeScript, but I think those are two of the reasons at least that certainly on our rankings and on your rankings as well, it's gone way up.
That's really interesting, and I think it's really important to note that it's not just JavaScript communities that we're seeing this trend in this year, but it's also across other languages as well. I think it's not an accident that Kotlin and Rust are both on our fastest growing list, because they're showing some of the similar trends. Kotlin, for example, there it is. Kotlin has grown more than 2.5 times in the number of contributors that are writing Kotlin this year, and Rust has almost doubled. So let's talk a little bit about what's behind that huge growth.
Yeah, again, sort of, we should make this session 3 or 4 times as long next time. But with Kotlin in particular, Kotlin's a language. I believe I'm sort of remembering this correctly. We've been doing our language ranking since 2010. And Kotlin, out of all of them, is the 2nd fastest growing language that we've seen after Swift. So, basically, again, in terms of looking at the language and sort of, looking at the reasons it's popular, one of the ones, very much like TypeScript, is that it's able to build off of intermingle with a very large language community in Java, right? So you have the ability to, sort of intermingle code, the ability to run on top of the JVM. So it's an easy fit, for Java developers, which there are millions of them in the world. Tons and tons of businesses obviously run Java. So you have that sort of built-in audience sort of to appeal to, and you have a syntax which is nice, it's clean. It's something that developers enjoy, actually enjoy using. So Kotlin has just been a real phenomenon of growth. And certainly, I guess the last thing to talk about, is, at least in our rankings, the thing that really tipped it was the nod from Google. That Kotlin is now a first-class citizen on the Android platform. Really kind of pushed it over the edge from, hey, this is interesting, it's growing quickly, to, okay, now this is a legit phenomenon.
That's really cool. So I think what we're hearing is there's a really big emphasis on interoperability across all of these 3 languages. How do you think that's changing how software is written?
Well, I think it's, we live in a essentially polyglot world, right? We live in a world where, if you go back 10, 20 years ago, most of the environments tended to be pretty standardized. You would be, largely a Java shop or a Microsoft shop or some combination of both. And what we see in organizations now are, sort of a lot of different languages used, a lot of different languages employed. You may have applications which, one application may include 3 or 4 or 5, cases, different languages, which is, night and day different than it was, 5 or 10 years ago. Part of that, however, is that the languages that tend to be successful are the languages that are versatile and have the ability either to appeal to an existing base. We talked about TypeScript, Kotlin's the same. All the other languages sort of that sit on the JVM, would be another example. Clojure, Groovy, et cetera. So, the ability to sort of appeal, to that existing population is huge. You have, languages that just are versatile, right? They can be used for lots of different things as opposed to languages which are more sort of single domain or single purpose. So, I think it's the versatility and the ability to transcend different communities and build on the sort of existing platform strength, which is huge.
That is huge, and I think coming back to that example we talked about earlier, it's not an accident that definitely typed is so popular, because what it's allowing you to do is it's allowing you to reuse a lot of older JavaScript libraries that you're used to, but adding static typing to them.
Yeah, you make that transition easier. That's exactly right.
Exactly. So it's all about interoperability. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't call out Python before we moved on. Python isn't just in the top 3 programming languages, but it's also still one of the fastest growing, and that's huge. Python's been around a long time. And this is in huge part because of its role in data science and machine learning communities, and you've heard about a little bit from Emoju this morning, but let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, Python is a legit phenomenon of its own, right? So it's always been top 5 on our rankings. It's now number 3, and has been for sort of a couple runs now. And when we look at it, to me, a lot of the appeal, we can have arguments about syntax and ease of sort of learning and so on, but a lot of it comes down to the fact that it's just a tremendously versatile language, right? So it's been used for data science, it's been used, as you point out, for ML, it's been used for standard application development, sort of in a variety of different contexts. So it has escaped the trap of just sort of being hey, I'm just for the front end, or I'm just for the back end, or I'm just for data science, or whatever. Instead, it's essentially a tool that developers can come in and use, and then apply in many, many different contexts across the course of their careers. So yeah, it's not a surprise that it's as popular as it is today.
Yeah, and I think what I'm most excited about is that all of these languages, Kotlin, TypeScript, Rust, Python, they're all actively developed open source projects on GitHub. And in fact, we've been talking about open source this entire time, right? The localized examples that we highlighted in Brazil and Nigeria, and of course the open source tools that are programming languages themselves. So, for the final portion of this chat, let's zoom out a little and take a macro look at the open source trends that we're looking at as a whole. Now, this might have been hard to imagine 10 years ago, but take a look at our list of top contributors to open source this year.
Yeah. I would not have predicted that 5 years ago, I can tell you that.
Right? This is a list of organizations on GitHub who have the most members contributing to open source. And organizations on GitHub are, of course, just collections of people. They can be free or paid, work in public or in private. And what we're seeing is that every year, there are more and more open source contributions from organizations that represent large tech companies. And a big part of that trend is that companies are open sourcing parts of their stack. Like this year, React.js is trending, and that's a JavaScript library for creating user interfaces that came out of Facebook. Also trending is Dopamine. It's a research framework for reinforcement learning algorithms, and that came out of Google. And of course, VS Code is our largest open source community this year, and that was open sourced by Microsoft. So Steve, what are the advantages for a company like that to open source portions of their stack?
Well, I think what we've seen, certainly over the last 5 or 10 years, is just an evolution in understanding, right? So it's essentially it's a spectrum, it's a life cycle that companies go through. Some companies today, many of them were born in a world where open source is common and mainstream. Most of the companies we're talking about were not. They predate that era. So basically what they've gone through is this journey, right? And the journey sort of initially, in many cases, sort of revolves around the fact that, hey, if I wrote this software, somebody must pay me for it, that's the value. And therefore, when I sit down and look at the calculus in terms of, hey, do I open source this or do I not? The way that they would look at that would say, all right, look, the benefits to keeping it closed outweigh, the benefits to opening it. What we see today is sort of much more of a realization that, fewer and fewer pieces of software are actually differentiating, right? There are many, many sort of characteristics that go into, why software is important or valuable or what have you. So, sort of in a very abbreviated sense, basically what we have is a world where, more and more organizations, and these are people who sell technologies, these are people who sell services, these are people who aren't technology companies at all, look at this and say, you know what, I actually get a lot more from releasing this as open source software. In other words, in many cases I can get fixes and patches submitted by the community. I may be able to amortize the cost of development across more organizations. And truly, is this differentiating for me? Is this the secret sauce? Probably not, and if not, the benefits of opening it, sort of generally speaking, outweigh the benefits to keeping it closed. So there's lots of exceptions, for individual assets. Not every company obviously has taken this journey, but I think by and large, that's what you see from the market.
Fair enough, and I think it's also important to recognize that it's helpful in things like hiring, because people who are familiar with your tools are easier to onboard and things like that.
Absolutely, hire, retain,
and retention, absolutely. And of course, a lot of these projects are sometimes given over to the community to maintain as they become more mature through things like the Apache Incubator or the CNCF Foundation that formed around the Kubernetes project, which is also trending this year. And of course, as organization-owned projects are growing, that doesn't mean we're seeing less projects that are created by developers individually. Those are growing just as fast. And among independent open source projects like this, we're seeing trends in things like home automation with Home Assistant, which works with your Alexas, your Nest Hub, your smart light bulbs. 3D printing projects like Marlin, which is one of the most widely used 3D printing firmware in the world. Did you know that? I didn't know that. Scientific software like Spider, which is a Python IDE that's designed specifically for scientists. You can always hop over to the report for more examples like this and links to all of the things that we talked about. But the second macro trend that we're seeing in open source this year that I'd like to highlight is that international contributions to open source are growing much more year over year. Steve, is there a relationship between growth in technology in general and open source growth?
Yeah, I think I really don't see how you build the argument to the contrary, honestly. Because basically, going back to the point that we just made in terms of organizations looking at this and saying, hey, I can essentially share the cost of development for these pieces at the bottom, across a number of organizations, across sort of outside contributors. What that means, sort of in some zero-sum sense, is that time not spent, for every company reinventing the same thing, is time that they can then, spend elsewhere, inventing new projects. And again, not all of those new projects will be released as open source software, but many of them are, right? So, I think basically when you look at it, it's pretty clear that the contributions from an open source standpoint end up, basically fueling this dramatic increase. And this has been true, certainly in North America for a while, but really what we're seeing sort of, with all these new emerging communities that we've talked about, and certainly, go check out the report, there's so many of them. There's so much growth around the world. Many of the sort of geographies abroad almost have it easier in the sense that they didn't grow up with, this sort of, this mindset that anything that is written as a piece of software must be charged for, must be closed source, and so on. So yeah, I think those two trends I think are inextricably linked, at least in my mind.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think what it sounds like is that there are a couple of reasons why there's more international contributions. One of them is that there are more contributions to bigger projects because people are discovering them. Like TypeScript has contributors from 100 different countries.
Yeah, which is amazing.
And that's just this year alone. That's amazing. But it's also because we're seeing open source projects released that are created internationally to address specific technology needs in those regions. And an example we're seeing this year that's trending is the Godot engine. It's a cross-platform 2D and 3D game engine, and that was initially developed in Argentina for a set of private companies because there was a market gap. And eventually it was open sourced, and now it's a large community and it's trending on GitHub.
There you go.
Steve, I think it's really interesting that our trending open source projects, regardless of who created them, whether it's a company or individual, they're just such close reflections of the trends that you're seeing in technology over the past few years. So I think what we're seeing today, everyone, is that the work that you, our community, is doing on GitHub closely mirrors development trends all over the world. You're solving both local and global social, financial, and technology needs, but you're also building on and contributing back to technology growth everywhere else in the world. Thank you for making tools better for everyone.
Thank you indeed.
You're also choosing new tools that are opinionated about things like types and memory safety because your work is becoming more complex. And you're choosing tools that offer interoperability with existing stacks, so you can build on code that came before. And finally, we're seeing that open source is at the heart of all of these trends. It's not just a reflection, but an active driver of innovation in technology today. And all of that's happening right here on GitHub. The next 10 years are looking really exciting. Steve, it's been really great chatting with you today. Thank you for lending us a view into these industry trends and how they're reflected in our community. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us.
Not at all, my pleasure. Cheers, thank you.
Thank you. Now, we've talked a lot, but we barely scratched the surface in terms of the insights in the Octoverse report. The report is live right now, so make sure you check it out for the rest of it, for more numbers, methods, and of course references to all the things we talked about today. I'm also really thrilled to announce that we're starting a blog series. The series is going to expand on today's highlights and also other things that we thought were interesting from the report. So stay tuned for more important stories, and the first one is coming out a week from today, and it will run all the way through till the end of the year. Thanks again, Steve and Redmonk. Thank you to the Octoverse team for pulling all of this together, and thank you, our community, for every commit and PR that you made. We can't wait to see what you build next. See you next year.